what kinds of actions are those funds going to be used for? Because I think it's not quite right to have an arbitrary number that we release now and based on, and then have reports come in to figure out what to do next. So
I think we outlined in the grant proposal what the allocation would be per year. The initial allocation is that we would have some additional modification to the treatment system in the first year, and then the operations would be then from there forward. It works out to be approximately a little less than $200,000 per year is what it works out to be over the 5 years. And I do have a cost breakdown, so we do have that listed. And so if the board felt comfortable in allocating, for instance, the first 2 years of allocation that included the modification and 2 years, we have no problem with the Water Quality Authority providing the reports necessary to justify our expenditures, none whatsoever.
And will you be looking at the engineering? Because I thought that was an interesting
Yes, we're going to be
point.
doing additional engineering on this, and hopefully working very closely with EPA and DTSC in the future on being able to get additional modeling and mapping.
So as we continue hearing this item, I think there are other speakers. If staff could give some thought to some language to be added to the resolution to allocate the funding, but to release only a certain amount, and you know, should recommend what that amount would be, and then condition the release of the remaining fund based upon submittals of the various information that we've started to discuss. And also, perhaps also a direction to the executive director to work with EPA and DTSC on ensuring that this is included in the ROD. Thank you.
We'd be glad to brief State Board staff on progress with EPA on the ROD and any other activities we're involved with.
Yeah, I do appreciate your comments because that is the end game I see, is to get this orphan contaminant release. It feels to me that it's not an orphan site, it's an orphan contaminant with a different engineering solution. And I appreciate the commitment to include this in the record of decision. It's very important.
I do as well. And actually, I like board members more use of the term exit strategy. I think in going forward, I would like to see, or at least have a better understanding of what the exit strategy is for this particular site and the cleanup involved there. So that should also be included in the report back to the board.
Not a problem.
Thank you, Ray. Mr. Riggi, we've beaten this to death. You have, if needed, you feel needed?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, board members. Dan Arrighi, Water Resources Manager, San Gabriel Valley Water Company. San Gabriel Valley Water Company has a treatment plant just south of the Whitmore plant. We are in support of this. If this is not remediated at that site, it will migrate to San Gabriel's treatment plant, and we will be out 5,000 gallons a minute of water, which provides water to 6 different cities and a small mutual water company, and it's also emergency interconnection for the city of Monterey Park, which is also impacted under the South El Monte operable unit. So I would ask the board to please fund this so that our treatment facility can go forward and provide water, drinking water. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Any questions that I may answer? Thank you. Good
Fine.
morning.
Thank you. It appears to me that I may have a motion and a second off to my right here.
I'd like to hear from staff in terms of recommended addition to the resolution first, and then I'll be happy to make the motion.
And while we're waiting for staff, I just want to let the board know, and those who are in the audience know, we're very lucky to have Ken Manning at this agency now. He was water master for Inland Empire for the Santa Ana River as well, and has worked very closely with Region 8 as well as Region 4. So he's quite responsible. So thank you, Ken, for being here and answering these questions forthrightly.
Can I help you, sir?
Yeah, good morning, Chair Hoppin and members of the board. I'm here on behalf of Senator Ed Hernandez. As you know, Senator represents many of the communities in the San Gabriel Basin whose drinking water wells are in imminent danger from migration of the contamination plume. That is the subject of the funding requests before the board today. He couldn't be here himself, but requested that I submit to the record his strong support, and look forward to your favorable vote. So thank you.
Thank you. Are you passing notes or giving him language, Michael?
Semaphore with eyebrows. Your staff had actually heard some of the concerns from Ms. Dodek the other day and had taken a crack at some language, and then based on the comments received from DTSC and from the Water Quality Authority today, I've, as well as the additional concerns raised by some of the board members, I've taken a crack at revising that language, and I'm going to go ahead and try to read it into the record. Unfortunately, because it's been heavily modified, there's nothing that we have printed up at this point in time, but I think it'll be pretty obvious what we're trying to accomplish. This would modify the resolved clauses of the resolution that's before the board on this item. And the first resolved clause, and there is an administrative cleanup, it needs to read, therefore be it resolved that the State Water Board, and then one, instead of just approving the $955,000, I hear from the Water Quality Authority that they see a need for a 2-year release, and they anticipate that it's about $200,000 a year. So the first clause would be modified to read as follows. Conditionally approves $955,646 from the cleanup and abatement account to fund the project, and then here comes the addition, comma, of which $400,000 is hereby authorized to be released to address immediate concerns related to 1,4-dioxane contamination in the identified areas in the San Gabriel groundwater basin, period. So that first clause would now conditionally authorize $955,000 instead of authorizing the entire amount, but then would release immediately $400,000 designed to burn through the first 2 years. There would be a new second resolved clause that would read, requires the San Gabriel Basin Water Quality Authority to submit yearly progress reports to the executive director or his or her delegee prior to the release of the remaining funds, and then parenthetical, $555,646, close paren, and delegates release of the remaining funds, comma, in increments the executive director determines appropriate, comma, upon his or her finding that the progress reports are satisfactory, period. Among the factors that constitute a satisfactory progress report are the following, colon, demonstration of adequate progress on the cleanup, comma, for example, comma, reduction in contaminant concentrations, semicolon, updated modeling and capture zone analysis, semicolon, compilation of relevant monitoring well data, semicolon, and any other pertinent information pertaining to cleanup and long-term funding for the site, period. That is, and then that's the end of the addition to that resolved clause. I know, Board Member Dodek, you had raised interest in having a closure plan. I think the process under SWRCB is all designed to get to that, and that's what US EPA and DTSC are going through the SWRCB process, and that will culminate in the record of decision. But I know the concern that I hear from the board members is having a funding exit strategy, hence the addition of requirements that they actually begin to identify to us what their long-term funding for the site would be. Then the next additional resolved clause would read, and this is a new one in its entirety, directs the executive director or his or her delegee to request from the Department of Toxic Substances Control and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency an evaluation of the feasibility of adding the contaminant of concern, parenthetical 1,4-dioxane, close paren, to the final, comma, and if possible, the interim, comma, record of decision, comma, in order to integrate the project into the South El Monte operable unit and to provide an ongoing funding source for the project, period. And then we would renumber the remaining resolved clauses accordingly. The new resolved 4 would stay the same except for numbering, and then resolved 5 for grammatical purposes would be modified to just say that it makes the funds available until September 30th, 2018, and will revert any unexpended funds to the cleanup and abatement account.
Just one question, Michael. We've heard some comments today from DTSC as well as the Water Authority that there's some confidence that 1,4-dioxane will be included in the ROD. So why not just request that it be included instead of requesting an evaluation of the feasibility of its inclusion.
In terms of the feasibility, part of the reason why I have that language in there is because from the comments I heard today, we have an interim record of decision. It's not a trivial exercise to actually reopen an interim record of decision, and so I think there's a feasibility assessment associated with that, especially given the fact we're only talking about a 5-year horizon, as I understand it, until we're likely to be to the final record of decision. However, if you wanted, I could quickly recast that to basically say that we request them to include 1,4-dioxane in the final record of decision and request feasibility of adding 1,4-dioxane to the interim record of decision.
I think I prefer that.
Okay. Well, what I just read, or in answering that question, I provided the language, and we'll memorialize that in the final motion, or in the final written version, assuming that a motion is made to adopt this language.
Actually, I will go ahead and make that motion.
Second?
All those in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. Tom, before we introduce item number 6, why don't we take a break until 1/4 so we can finish without having a break at 11:15 or something?
Well, I have to say it's interesting because part of it was I was, life is a blur, right? You're trying to learn things, and I was being valuable for doing what I thought was common sense, and I thought, like, why do I have to keep, particularly with my own community, to say everybody's my community, but my own community, why do I have to keep, like, sitting down and saying, like, here's how you distribute? Do you guys want to move? Yeah, actually, that would be nice. So, I thought, I gotta, like, exercise some new skills and stuff like that. And plus, I was getting irritable, and as I like to say, it's hard to be the princess of peace when you just. So, so I went off to learn, so it was interesting to come back when I took the NREC job, which was institutional, and I just immediately, people said, we need you in this room. And part of me was, well, I can't quite figure it out because I'm not as smart as a lot of the people, but for whatever reason, people seem to think there's something helpful about it, because I'm more of a social worker, I guess, anything else. So now I'm happy to feel valuable again and appreciate it.
Which normally was falling.
Well, also, I like people, and that helps a bit. Yeah. And this is fun because I'm getting back to learning a lot of the technical stuff. So I'm in issue heaven, which is just so interesting, all these different things. So,
How are you? Good to see you.
So yeah, I'm having fun. I still I haven't totally hit my stride yet, but I'm starting to come out of the. Well, yeah, and so I told Tom this. I mean, at some point I do want to come out again. I mean, I know it came out, but it was in the 90s. I would love to come out again and spend a little time. I was a little landlocked when I first started, both trying to get briefings because I had broken my wrist, and it was hard for me to be mobile. And now I'm awake.
Well,
and,
I don't know if it's kind of hard to do it in organized fashion. It's appropriate. There's a lot going on in the Delta. Sam, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. We're doing a lot of legends and stuff like that. The important stuff is going to be how we deal with the flows of the projects.
Right, no, exactly. And also on the question, and this we'll get to this soon in appropriate time, I think it still is something I can talk to you about, as opposed to things I can't talk to people about outside the room. But, you know, on the San Joaquin flows and the Southern Delta salinity, I'd love to talk to you guys about what you think. I'll go in and read written comments. I wasn't here when they did all the hearings, so I need to catch up on that.
Well, you know,
And how much of that can protect you? I mean, we got to do that right too.
non-degradation is a policy of the state and Clean Water Act. And these guys want to run over it.
Well, no, that's why, to me, I think there's the focus on the BDCP fight, which is totally valuable, but there's also how do we do our standards in a way that guarantees. I mean, you need belts and suspenders on this one, right? And so I think sometimes people don't pay attention to our standards because they don't trust anybody and they worry about the canal. And that's an important fight and another fight. But we got to get our standards right too, so that it guarantees the flows you need no matter what the plumbing.
I'm here today just to talk about this turn lane.
Oh, I was guessing that's what you were here for. It's interesting to me.
Anyway, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. I'll come out so we can spend a good long time.
Yeah, all right.
Okay. We only have 3 more minutes, right? So I can't run upstairs. You need, well, please bring something. No, I was just gonna put some stuff on my desk, and I just have logistics, because I want to get out of here as early as I can, make it the earliest one I can to get down there, and I still need to print out more stuff or make sure I have my file for the next trip and all that. And when do you leave? I leave on Friday morning, which is why I'll leave thingy, CFE, by 10 at the latest, probably 9:45. They just couldn't move the schedule around, so, but, our flight's at a week. A week. And where in Mexico? Merida. We're going to Merida. I love Merida. My CEC commission thing that I'm on is meeting in Merida midweek. So I'm getting Warner there so we can see Merida and go to ch11, which he's never been to. Oh, it's great. So we're going to do 2 nights at ch11. We're actually going to be there on 12/12/12, although that's not the day the world ends. It'll be kind of fun to be there that month.
Well, we went to, I bet we've been to Merida and into that region. Really? A lot, yeah. Well, when we lived back east, it was our favorite place to go for Mexico.
Oh, no, that's great. So you tell me about, because Merida,
It's
any
wonderful.
sense of,
Oh,
and
Merida.
the only place, it's a colonial city. I love that look, so I figured, that's why I didn't choose to go into town and go to Cancun or something. I thought, oh, I'm here.
Yeah, no, it's very nice, and it is colonial, and I mean, of course, it's been 10 years probably since we were there, but or maybe even longer. Ch11 is absolutely fabulous, but also what's the one that's right close to Merida? It's Tulum.
Or Oxford, one or the other.
Tulum, I think it's Tulum. We stayed there one night.
All right, Mr. Howard, would you please introduce item number 6, please? If you do, everybody will stop talking. I know they will.
Item number 6 is the information item on CV salts, a project that's been Central Valley Regional Board's been working on for a number of years. The board several years ago allocated $5 million to this project, but then had it allocated out in an incremental way, and the CV salts program is requesting that the final $1.8 million be released. I see we have some Jeannie Chilcott from Region 5, but also some distinguished guests from the regulated community here to address you.
So I can begin then. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Jean Chilcott. I'm a senior scientist with the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board. I'm here today leading off a 2-part item for your consideration. The first part of the item is the actual annual report on the stakeholder-driven CV salts initiative. I'll be providing an initial introduction to that item, but then I'll be handing it over to representatives of our many stakeholder committees. We have Debbie Webster from SWRCB, David Corey, who is the chair of the Central Valley Salinity Coalition, the stakeholder membership group, and Perry Clausen, who is chairing our executive committee for the CV Salts effort, which is basically the decision-making body of the entire effort. Once we finish the annual report, they will return the presentation back to me, and we'll enter into part 2, which is the consideration of the resolution to actually release the remaining cleanup and abatement funds so that we can complete the initiative. So as I stated in the beginning, this is a collaborative basin planning effort. We are utilizing the multiple stakeholders engaged to develop a salinity and nitrate management plan for the entire Central Valley. The Central Valley salt issues are really very simple. More salt is entering the valley than is leaving the valley. If we look into the Sacramento and San Joaquin Delta with consumptive use, the salinity concentrations increase. The two basins exit out of the delta where the water is rediverted either back into the San Joaquin or down into the Tulare or to other parts of California. For the Tulare Lake Basin, there is no exit, so everything that comes into the basin remains in the basin. The issues aren't new. We've known about these for decades. The salt buildup has not only threatened agricultural productivity, but land is currently going out of production as the salt has accumulated in the soil profile. We also have an additional issue with nitrate, which is a saline element, where it is impacting the groundwater and threatening and impairing drinking water sources. Some of the current activities are using fresh water for dilution to actually try to meet beneficial uses, but this could essentially end up in that fresh water lost to other uses within the valley. Early on in the project, an economic study was done by the University of California, Davis, and the numbers were staggering. If management was not changed within the next 20 years, the university estimated that we could have total impacts statewide up to $3 billion. And at this point, in looking at the various sources of salinity, there's really no means of distributing these costs equally. And we say that because the sources are so diverse. We have both regional sources, ag, urban, rural, anything that has consumptive water use. But we're also have many local sources. All of us within the basin and receiving water from the Central Valley contribute to the issue, because whenever you have consumptive use of water, you will increase the salinity. Because of the diversity, we did want to approach this issue with stakeholder-based solutions. And a big part of that is, since everyone's part of the issue, everyone needs to be part of the solution. And we wanted to make sure that the stakeholders, who in the end will be regulated and will need to come up with these solutions, have involvement and ownership in the final decisions. By using all the stakeholders in developing the solutions, we hope to better address all the needs and concerns, utilize everyone's resources wisely, and end up at the end of the day with a basin plan that's based on better data and much more effective. The CV Salts effort actually began in 2006 with a joint state and regional board workshop where all the stakeholders came together and agreed that this did need a stakeholder solution. We did need to approach this project together. And there were some initial products that were produced, which included the economic report. In 2009, there was a memorandum of agreement that was signed between the State Board, the Central Valley Water Board, and also the Central Valley Salinity Coalition, which is a membership stakeholder group who is participating in the process. And that memorandum of agreement reiterated the fact that this would be a stakeholder process and the various groups would move together in trying to solve the issue. As part of that agreement, the State Board determined that it was appropriate to use cleanup and abatement funding to provide seed money for the effort. And again, this is seed money. It's not to pay for the entire project. $1.2 million was approved in 2009, and an additional $3.8 million was approved in 2010, for a total of $5 million for the overall effort. For the $3.8 million that was approved in 2010, it was incrementally approved. So $2 million was initially made available to continue on the project, but the final $1.8 million was only to be made available, even though it was approved, it was only to be made available after the group had demonstrated sufficient progress, and the State Board approved that progress. There were a few additional requirements in the 2010 resolution, and one included the annual report at a public hearing, which is why we're here today. And that report has to include very specific details on the expenditures to date of the funding, the services that have been provided, the contributions from stakeholders, accomplishments, and our timeline to actually complete the project. So I'd like to turn it over now to Debbie Webster to begin providing some of the details of the annual report.
Thank you. Good morning, Board. This morning, what I'm going to cover are the status of the funds that we've...
Debbie, is your microphone on?
It's on.
Oh, yeah.
Cleanup and abatement funds that have, let me see if we can get that even better, that have been spent to date. What we are in the process of completing with those funds and with stakeholder contributions, and also go over the monetary and in-kind contributions that stakeholders have made to this process. As shown in this slide, since 2008 and through fall of this year, we have expended almost $9 million towards this project. Approximately $1 million of the $3.2 million of the cleanup and abatement money has been spent. The majority of the rest is encumbered, and we'll go over that a little bit later. But what I want to point out here is that the stakeholder contributions have been significant. We have almost, to date, spent $8 million through direct cash contribution and in-kind services. I'm first going to go over some of the services that that have been paid for by the cleanup and abatement account, and then go over some of those other areas. So starting with the cleanup and abatement projects that we've completed to date, we've updated our strategic plan in order to establish a work plan which identifies the work needed to get to our end goal, which is the salt and nutrient management plan and basin plan amendments to support CV salts. We've also completed phase 1 of the GIS database tool. This tool will identify the beneficial uses and water quality objectives and link the sources with FATE, and will be key in identifying implementation measures. Also, in order to maintain communication and continue our outreach to those who live in the Central Valley or use water that comes from the Central Valley, we have updated our website and developed a salinity brochure. We are continuing to work on the Lower San Joaquin River Basin Plan amendment for salinity, and have completed the work plan, problem statement, and other key evaluations. And also, to aid in the development of appropriate water quality objectives, we have completed white papers on salinity and nitrate for the municipal beneficial use and irrigated agriculture. We are also in progress on working on some other areas where stakeholder funding is matching these efforts. CV Salts have secured the services of a technical project manager and policy discussion facilitator, so that both the projects that are needed to develop the plan and the policy discussions that are needed in order to implement it will move forward in a timely manner. Like the work that we did for the municipal and agricultural beneficial uses, we're reviewing aquatic life criteria so that this beneficial use is protected. We are also continuing to work on our GIS database and beneficial use maps. And these three bullets, I'm not going to go into detail right now because David will go into this later in our presentation.
David, I need to interrupt you for just a second. For those of you that are here on the Water Master's report, we're not going to get to it if we stay on the schedule before noon, but I'm going to take it after this item. So if there's, I see a few folks that maybe aren't here that were here. If you would let them know that when we finish this item, we're going to do the Water Master's report, I'd appreciate it. Excuse me for interrupting you, Debbie.
Oh, not a problem. We are also working hard to evaluate and ground truth policy and implementation options and to work towards early implementation. SWRCB is an evaluation of management options for salts that are generated in the valley and will be key to developing the management plan options that come out of the salt and nutrient management plan. We are also, am I not on the right? Thank you. We are also working on several case studies to, and I'd like to highlight the very last one, which is working with a stakeholder group representing disadvantaged communities that have nitrate and other water quality concerns. They are working to identify appropriate pilot projects, and we're working with them to help implement those. And so that is a process that's going on, but it's just one of the early implementation measures that we're doing. And again, we'll be explaining some of these a little bit later in the presentation in more detail. This slide shows the contributions that started in 2008 and go through 2014. So some of them are current contributions, but there's also future estimates. Stakeholder contributions are expected to exceed $11 million. It's also important to note that the expenditures have been rapidly accelerating to complete the technical work needed to complete the CV salts efforts. From stakeholders, the contributions have been made through direct monetary contribution and in-kind services. Monetary contributions are made through the Central Valley Salinity Coalition. This coalition is a nonprofit organization made up of more than 20 stakeholder groups that actively participate in CV salts. These stakeholders include cities and counties, agricultural interests, water purveyors, dairies, and other industries. Contributions to the Salinity Coalition go to fund work required to complete the necessary work for CV salts. Stakeholders have also supported CV salts through providing study, basin plan support, and water quality information gathering. The $9.5 million shown in this slide is just a sampling of the projects that are underway by stakeholders. I'm going to go over those three different types of projects, starting with an example of the treatment alternatives. So one example is the Tulare Lake Basin Spray Fields project. This is a full-scale pilot project intended to concentrate and store salts as a disposal option. Other treatment alternatives are outlined in Table 4 of the staff report and include water supply feasibility, salinity minimization, management practice tools, and other similar efforts. This slide highlights several examples of basin plan support that have been provided by stakeholders. These efforts are needed because the expertise, information, and support these efforts are needed to provide expertise, information, and support to develop a regulatory structure and flexibility, including tools to manage salt, protect beneficial uses in a way that is sustainable and supported by different communities. There's also been significant contributions in the form of water quality data and studies that are needed for the salt and nutrient management plan that would otherwise be needed to be supported through other funding options. The information gathered in these efforts are being integrated into the CV salts work plan. These water quality studies include source identification and other water quality monitoring efforts. And again, those are highlighted in Table 4 of the staff report. As shown on this slide, significant stakeholder contributions have been made over the last 3 years and will continue through the completion of the plan and into the implementation where the major costs are likely. Oops, this slide highlights some of the efforts that are not included in the summary charts that we just went on over, but are contributions to the CV salts efforts. These efforts come from stakeholders as they participate in CV salts. For example, various stakeholder groups are working to consolidate management practice that can be utilized to reduce salt and nitrates into a toolbox form. We also there's a significant effort by stakeholders in just participating in this project. We have monthly meetings, policy meetings, we have technical meetings. It is a very labor-intensive but a very committed stakeholder group to get this work done. And I can't emphasize that enough because it does take a lot of effort. There's also activities that are on the ground that are going to address salts now. Some are permit required and some are voluntary. I want to highlight that the permit required are just a portion of what is being done. And these are a sampling. So these costs that you're seeing, the $7 million and $42 million, we're not even beginning to capture all the work that's done. So we are not waiting for the Basin Plan amendment to actually reduce salts. So far, I've covered a lot of information. David's going to cover some, but if there's been something that you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it now. Otherwise, we'll pass the baton and keep going from here.
Good evening, or good morning, I guess it is, board members. David Corey, Chair of the Central Valley Salinity Coalition. I want to reiterate, if you do have questions, go ahead and interrupt us. It's no problem whatsoever, depending upon your question. If we don't like it, we'll just move on. Again, these are the basic accomplishments that we've had in 2012. We updated the strategy and framework and work plan, and we initiated significant technical work to support our policy discussions and looking at the beneficial use and water quality objectives. We also have begun technical work to look at implementation planning. This stakeholder process, again, is all, the stakeholders have embraced it, and so the ultimate product of this will come out with support of a broad basis of stakeholders. The ultimate goal here is to come up with a salt and nitrate management plan for the entire Central Valley, from the Oregon border down to the Tehachapi's. An ominous task for certain. One thing in looking at this, when you looked at the original intent of the recycled water policy, it was sort of assumed that those issues above the line here on this slide were already adopted and established, and we didn't have to relook at those. But when we started looking at the stakeholders at the Central Valley and our basin plan, we realized that the designated beneficial uses in the basin plan, there were some problems with them that really didn't make sense. And we needed to go back and look at those identified water bodies, the beneficial uses, and the objectives to protect those uses before we moved on to sort of the nuts and bolts of coming up with the salt and nitrate management plan.
Oh, could I ask for a quick break? When you say they don't make sense, is it fair to say maybe you identified conflicts or, logical? I mean,
there are basically conflicts in what was in the basin plan with what's in reality on the ground, I guess. And we have some concrete examples of that in a little bit that I can point out, and if that doesn't answer your question, I'll try and address it further. Again, the strategy and framework, we're looking at revising regulatory structure, beneficial uses, water quality objectives, and policies. And we're also looking at policies and procedures to implement those and have some regulatory flexibility so that we can make sure we get those done with the least cost and actually get something done. So we're looking at both short-term and long-term management practices to address salts and nitrates in the various geographic regions throughout the Central Valley. When you look at this issue, as broad an area as we're dealing with, as complex as some of these problems are, we realize that we need to ultimately come up with area-specific plans, but we can't really tackle that initially. So we looked at this in sort of a three-tiered level, where you looked at the broad puzzle pictures at the top, basically the 30,000-foot schedule view of this, and said, okay, what are the broad policy issues that we need to have to be able to affect a rational and effective salt and nitrate management plan? And then how can we implement those in a smaller scale? So we have sort of the large, broad-scale policy issues, the mid-scale management type discussion, and then the actual on-the-ground, site-specific processes. And since we have a short time frame to get this accomplished, rather than we sort of have to run this all of these processes at once. So we're discussing the broad policy issues, but we're also implementing some site-specific efforts and archetypes and prototypes to ground truth those policy discussions, those policy decisions, to make sure that what we're looking at in the abstract will work in the specifics down at the regional and regionally specific level. Some of the big policy issues that we have talked about are the application of the municipal and ag beneficial uses, and what are the appropriate beneficial uses for different water bodies in the Central Valley. If you look at ag-dominated water bodies, is it appropriate to have a municipal use designation in a small ag drain alongside of a road? In groundwater basins, what is the appropriate beneficial use for different groundwater basins? Some of them, certainly they are drinking water sources, but if you look at the Tulare Lake bed in the problem area down there on the west side, where they have very shallow perched water tables with high salts and other constituents in there, does it make sense that we can ever have that as a municipal drinking source? We need to look at these and make sure that those initial assumptions in our sources of drinking water policy make sense, and work that through before we come up with an implementation plan.
Let me ask a question there. In ag-dominated water bodies, did you address issues, kind of unintended consequences of the salt issue on irrigation? You know, if shallow groundwater is too salty for ag use, not for drinking water use, but for ag use, there is a likelihood that someone would, you know, kind of go deeper into the ground to find the appropriate type of water that would be good for irrigation, and yet that may be creating some, you know, subsidence issues and other things in the valley, which we are starting to see. Have you addressed that at all in this discussion or not?
Well, we haven't specifically addressed subsidence issues, but we have looked at how we can deal with the different regions and where their sources of water. Most of those areas that have those perched water tables are utilizing water from surface water supplies that are imported from other areas. But this idea of tapping into deeper aquifers, we're wrestling with all that. What is the source of water? Do you assume that the ground overlying that water is using that water to farm with, or do they have another source? So when we're looking at this sort of mid-tier level of, hold on, where we are, the mid-tier, we're looking at developing management zones for ag management zones. So you look at what is the source of water for that area? Are they utilizing groundwater? Do they have a surface water supply? How does this fit together? And how does the reality on the ground fit with the broader policy issues? And then we'll move that down into more site-specific, sort of the smaller puzzle piece. I really like this picture, this slide, by the way. You know, again, there's many issues that we're dealing with, both on drinking water, municipal beneficial uses, and ag beneficial uses. We're looking at salinity, we're looking at nitrates on both sides, and we're also looking at surface water and groundwater. And there are different policy issues and sort of regulatory constraints on both of those issues versus, you know, from groundwater to surface water, municipal and ag drinking water, or and ag use. I talked a little bit about ground truthing some of our broad policy issues. We've looking at some of these archetype studies to look at beneficial uses, what are the appropriate beneficial uses and water quality objectives. We'll go into a little bit more specifics in the next slide, but ag-dominated water bodies, we're looking at some specific water bodies in the Sacramento Valley. We're looking at groundwater in the Tulare Lake bed. We're looking at these zone studies that I talked about in terms of ag use to try and figure out where are these ag folks getting their water to farm with, and what do you need to protect the ag use in that area. We're also looking at the lower San Joaquin River and trying to come up with an appropriate water quality objectives for salinity upstream of Vernalis in the lower San Joaquin River. The ag-dominated water body study is, I think, one of the better examples of some of the issues that we're dealing with here. There are 4 POTWs in the Sacramento Valley, small communities. I think it's this, you'll correct me, Debbie, if I get it wrong, but I think it's City of Live Oak, Biggs, Colusa, and what's the last one? Willows. in which the basin plan currently, they're discharging into a ditch similar to this at the bottom slide. Basically, it's a roadside ditch. And the sources of drinking water policy establishes drinking water standards in that ditch. There potentially could be forced to spend millions, between the four of them, tens of millions of dollars to protect to drinking water standards in that ditch. From our perspective, this doesn't make any sense. We need to look at this and make sure that we protect downstream water bodies for drinking water. But to think that we are going to be able to stick a straw in that ditch and drink out of it is ridiculous, basically. But that's what the basin plan says we have to do. And unless we relook at that and figure out how we can modify that to continue to drink, to protect those uses downstream, but not require these municipalities to spend that kind of money to protect a use that doesn't exist and will not exist, it's really hard to have efficient use of our resources and protect uses throughout the valley. Groundwater, I talked a little bit about that in the Tulare Lake bed, looking at the groundwater down there with the high salinity and perched water table. So we're looking at some archetypes down there to figure out how to deal with that type of an issue. We face a similar issue on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, in which my family farms on as well. We're going to use these prototypes or these archetypes to translate what we learned there into other regions so that we come up with a path to deal with these issues, one that makes sense from a policy perspective and actually can be implemented so they can be used in other areas of the state. The prototypes are looking at implementation alternatives. So I discussed the Lower San Joaquin River process in which we're establishing water quality objectives for salinity upstream of Vernalis. There's a whole subcommittee that works on that, and in that process we have various, all of these issues that are in the broader CV salts issue are within the Lower San Joaquin River. Debbie addressed what we're dealing with the disadvantaged communities in the South Valley on nitrates. We're working with some of our stakeholders who are members of the coalition that are intimately involved in the stakeholder process down there. We didn't think it made sense for us to inject our ideas as to how to solve those problems onto a process that's already taking place in the South Valley, and felt it made more sense to utilize the effort and resources that they're putting into their stakeholder process and leverage our resources to try and solve some of their problems that they identify. So we do have stakeholders from their area that come up to our meetings, and then stakeholders of the Salinity Coalition that work in their process as well.
David, you used the example of the Tulare Lake folks and then some examples up around Willows. It strikes me that we have a fundamental difference between the San Joaquin Valley and the North Valley, and that is the San Joaquin Valley, generally speaking, these waters you're talking about don't find their way into a larger water body and wind up being a source of drinking water. On the Willows example, I would certainly agree with you at the source, but ultimately it would seem like part of your evaluation has got to have to do with the assimilative capacity of the Sacramento River, in that case the Feather and others, because a lot of that drain water eventually does get to the Sacramento River and becomes a source of drinking water for the city of Sacramento, if you will. So it just seems like there's a fundamental difference in how you're ultimately going to recommend managing the salts in these different basins.
Yeah, and when you're looking at the downstream water bodies and protecting those water bodies that actually have a municipal use, those should be sort of the limiting factor. We should tailor our regulations to protect those water bodies. And I think if...
But how do you assign responsibility on that? I mean, ultimately, the downstream water body has got to have the capacity to deal with the salts that are being drained into it, but well, in the larger scheme of things, how do you apportion responsibility or loads, I guess, if you will?
Well, I think on the Sacramento, I know we dealt with this in some extent with the Vernalis TMDL for salinity, and I'm more familiar with that than how we do it on the Sacramento Basin. But basically what they did was assign load to different areas based on on geographic area and some basis of historic discharges, and they allocated that load. We have a salinity TMDL at Vernalis, and so we protect the drinking water, you know, the quality at Vernalis by assigning loads upstream. And so in that TMDL anywhere in that process, we don't really care what the water quality is in the ag drain next to the field. What we care is the total amount that's discharged into that water body. So you could come up with a loading type thing or some other process in which you allocated an amount of salts, if that's the issue, that can be discharged, and equitably allocate that amongst the area. And I think the different ways you can do it, again, is a geographic area. You could do it based on historic discharge if you wanted, or you could do a blend of the two to come up with some way to allocate that loading so that you ensure you meet those objectives in the water body that you care about downstream. But to just basically say you have to meet drinking water standards at every water body throughout the state,
I understand that perfectly. I mean, it's just that there's a fundamental difference in all these systems you're talking about, whether it's Tulare, whether it's Vernalis. The beneficial use of the Sacramento River is certainly quite different.
I agree, and that's why we're looking at trying to have the different levels of complexity and looking at the broad policy issues, and then trying to take it down to the site-specific areas and see, does this policy actually translate down into the more specific regional area? And can we translate that? Have we done it appropriately? And so it's very difficult. I mean, it's complex. And when you put on top of that the state's sort of overarching policy to try and put our waters to the beneficial use to the fullest extent possible, and you realize that most of your water use, you consumptively use it, you're going to concentrate salts. How do you balance those two competing interests of having appropriate water to protect beneficial uses, but also continue to use it? I mean, one of the things that I don't think that I often say is one of the easiest way to protect beneficial uses is to prevent or prohibit the use of water altogether. So we just prohibit the use of water. All uses would be protected. Yeah.
God.
So I don't advocate for that, but it would be a simple solution.
It's simple.
It is. It's a simple solution. But there's this tension between those two, and that's what I think CV Salts is trying to work out, is how can we continue to put water to beneficial use, consumptively use it, and still allow for beneficial uses throughout the basin. And it is a difficult task that we wrestle with. The S salts
acknowledge that all basins aren't created equally. I'll let you go.
No, they're not. They're not. And one thing that is interesting in this process is that we do have stakeholders from throughout the Central Valley, from Northern California throughout down to the South Valley. And so we're working together, realizing that there are different issues, certainly different issues on the west side and the east side of the San Joaquin Valley, Northern California, and the Tulare Lake bed. The S salt component of this is sort of the broad policy issue, which is really recognizing that when we consumptively use water, we're going to concentrate these salts. And what we're hoping, what we intend to do is come up with a rational policy of where do we want these salts to go. Okay, we can't just assume them away. We have to decide where do we want them to go out to the ocean through our rivers? Do we want to sequester them in certain areas? Where do we want them to go ultimately? And we want to develop policies that induce them to be stored in that place, and not just come up with policies that have them at random end up being held in certain ag grounds and put ag ground out of production, or be stored in groundwater areas that contaminate drinking water sources. That we have a plan as to how do we want to deal with these salt loads in a rational way and on a physical basis. So where do we want them to go? Have policies that induce us to get them to that spot.